The action genre has a real issue, and still has many real issues, with the idea of a hero being defeated, showing signs of weakness and having an overall vulnerability to them. We see our heroes rise to the challenge that the villains create for them and do it almost flawlessly, with the audience never truly feeling like they could die or even lose. Of course there's low points in the story, that's the whole point of the hero's journey, but there's never a point in the movie where you think they might not make it out. This doesn't stop though with just the action genre in films. Video games are too affected by this unstoppable empowering kick that comes from a beautiful cock of a gun. In this video I want to take us to the top of the Nakatomi Tower and crack our bones in the Far Cry franchise to slide all the way down and crash into the depths of the Baker Mansion with Capcom's latest entries into the Resident Evil franchise. I'm really excited to discuss how we're immersed and connected to the protagonists of our favourite first person shooters. I want to take a look into worlds of survival and worlds that are dripping with indefatigable feelings of dread and ripping away those barriers of safety we're all so used to.
Let's see what you got. Ethan.
Before we jump into gaming, we need to talk about one of the greatest films in cinema history. Bruce Willis's action Hollywood breakthrough, Die Hard. Nothing Lasts Forever is the name of the book that Die Hard is based on. Of course there was a lot that was changed between the book and the film, but the biggest change here has to be our main lead. In the book, which is also a sequel, our main character is a detective, Joe Leland. As in the films though, we get the ever lovable and hateable and very relatable John McClane.
Yippee-ki-yay, motherfucker.
They also have changed so much, but also share so much. There are big huge set pieces like jumping off the rooftop, or duct taping the gun to his back, or even the death of our main villain Hans Gruber is exactly the same, with a few plot twists here and there. There is a weight, grief and weakness that is shown and represented by both leads in the book and in the film. But it was Bruce Willis's charisma mixed with the directing of John Tierman that created an action film that solidified itself in history forever, and to this day, in my personal opinion, is unmatched in its action performances, pacing, and its application of vulnerability. The macho heroes of the 80s really needed to feel near godlike in their abilities to overcome the odds. Arnie's ability to go toe-to-toe with the Predator is a true thing of beauty and a cinema milestone of his career. Shut up! Sorry. The 80s created the gods of the genre and the lovable cliches I love about action, but Die Hard will always be remembered and truly turn the genre on its head, just in the first few seconds. The first thing we see and hear from our protagonist John is fear and a clenched fist while on a plane. In the first few seconds, the rules are laid out to us as the viewer, and shown the vulnerability of McClane's fears. He has a fear of flying and a fear of heights. But then he is told by a passenger right next to him that he should remove his shoes and crunch his toes into the carpet as soon as he lands. This all comes back into play later on. John's fear of death and failure is constantly given motive to his actions. And one of my favourite moments in the film is when John stumbles across Hans, our villain, discussing with the head of Nakatomi Tower, Takagi, that he needs to open the vault to get the money out or he will simply die. In this scene we see that John could easily fire at Hans or make a distraction which could possibly save Takagi's life, but decides not to. The movie could have had this huge glorious shootout, ending with John running out with Takagi in his hands like a true hero, and Hans on his knees while his goons are dead begging for his life. This could have happened in any other action movie, but it didn't, because this is Die Hard, and this is John McClane's reality. John failed to save Takagi, but with good reason. John throughout this movie constantly mumbles and expresses his plans and current mental state, and through these mumbles we see his true fear of death return, very much like it was on the plane.
Why the fuck didn't you stop him, John? Because then you'd be dead too, asshole. Think, goddammit, think.
It allows the viewer to keep up and follow how he works as a person. Bruce Willis was praised, and to this day is always going to be praised, for how he portrayed the hero. He felt like he needed to survive and he knew how to survive. But also with that survival instinct comes sacrifice that he must overcome and endure. Bruce Willis once said in an interview,
with Die Hard, I chose the role actually because I wanted to play against those other characters you mentioned. I think John McClane is the opposite of a superhero. He's not invincible. He's a very vulnerable guy. He's capable of being afraid and of making mistakes and feeling pain. And I think that's part of the reason the audience has responded so well to this film. It's about somebody that they know. It's not about this kind of larger than life character.
As much as Bruce Willis staples together these iconic moments with the wit and charm of John, it's actually the way the film uses its environments and context clues to set up these important moments and hit the story beats perfectly. We understand that there's a picture of John practically looking Hans right in the face, but is hidden due to an argument that happened between John and his wife earlier on. We understand and know the layout of the tower from top to bottom because of how the camera addresses the locations and also how John interacts with the environments, like the poster of the lady for example. And most importantly, we know why John is barefooted because of the advice of a strange man who sat next to him on a plane. There isn't a beat missed, and each and every key item is shown and serves its purpose for the plot and John's survival. The bare feet of John McClane lead to one of the most brutal and humanizing moments in the entirety of the film. After he is ambushed by Hans and his goons, he finds himself in a shootout behind some glass. Of course, this is foreshadowed in the background of the shots earlier on, but also leads to him needing to escape death once again. But by making that sacrifice he would rather not have to, and that is of course running over glass, barefooted. Bloodied and weak, John crawls his way into a bathroom and has to pull out huge shards of glass and stop the bleeding fast. In this scene, we see how human John really is as an 80s hero character. We see him cry, confess to Officer Powell that he might not make it out. He fears that he'll never see his wife and kids again, and of course he's afraid of being and dying alone. John fears the worst and tells us as the audience that he might not make it out. And for a moment, we believe him. What I love about Die Hard is even when you watch it for the 100th time, you're still convinced there's no guaranteed way of John winning and saving the day, and it's totally intentional. Bruce Willis brings a constant feeling of dread and humanization to the character and makes you feel like he could really die and fail at any moment. Even in the novel, Joe's character may and may not have died at the end of the story. It's never truly stated what happens to him. He's just beat up and left alone to suffer with his wounds. Joe Leland could have died that night, very much like John could have died in that final standoff with Hans. It's rare for the movie industry to use and innovate what Die Hard did so well, and there are the likes of John Wick or The Raid, but they come so far and few in between. But that doesn't mean Die Hard was any less influential on anything to come afterwards. Die Hard has changed action forever, and of course not just on the silver screen. There is a time, and there is a place for the heart-pounding, godlike feeling of first-person action games. There's nothing quite like the power of a well-designed weapon combined with the ever-evolving impact of a modern-day trigger from a controller, which has rumble features and special HD vibrations, only adding texture to every ricocheting bullet. For literally generations at this point, the FPS genre has understood the craving that most action fans want from their games. Huge unstoppable arsenals and to feel like an ultimate badass. From the hellscapes of Doom or the wall-running speeds of Titanfall, or of course even the atmospheric survival of a lone stalker in the Stalker franchise, the FPS genre has evolved, mastered, and even created some of the most entertaining games we have seen in the industry. The industry was forever changed when Wolfenstein 3D kicked down our doors and placed the player inside the levels, allowing them to engage with enemies head-on, face-to-face. The genre has seen many improvements and many innovations, and of course integrations, throughout its 30-year lifespan at this point. But only recently has it, to me personally, despite the genre creating this illusion of being in the world, it's now only finding interesting ways to allow the player to really feel like they are tethered between the world, the character, and themselves. Games that are first-person adventures on their own already create this integral feeling of the connection between the player and the character, making them feel generally more connected with their surroundings and even the challenges you face head-on. It might bring some intensity that generally has you thinking outside of the box otherwise. Grabbing your favourite gun with a fresh full new clip, checking those corners as tight as you can and making sure you don't get caught off guard. Maybe you're like me, maybe you're someone who really immerses himself with the character. You find yourself actually leaning and ducking in your chair in real life, hoping that it would help in the heat of the moment, but it never really does. Well, it does, but people don't really quite understand. And it's this connection right here that truly made the FPS genre feel groundbreaking at the time. We see so many games that truly allow us to feel like we're the characters we play in these immersive worlds. It could be something as simple as the Pip-Boy in the Fallout franchise, looking down at your wrist just to check your gear, or maybe it's just something like Half-Life where you never leave the first person during cutscenes. Of course, looking down at our bodies and seeing our feet, or even seeing our hands on the ladders, is just a small start to make the player and the character feel connected as one. But it's only really become a common thing now that we see the body pretty much all the time. It was so rare to look back down at a game in 2008 and see the body. I would usually even judge a game by that. I was always a fan of Halo and being able to see the full Master Chief player model, but then always judging Call of Duty for having the complete opposite option. But sometimes games take that idea and take it a little bit further. Think about the reboot of Alone in the Dark in 2008. The player was able to hold and shuffle through their inventory that was all displaced inside Edward's coat. But along with this, you also had to heal with sprays that you would see scars and scratches and wounds all over the character's body if you would look down, and you would even have to craft items on the fly that you would find in the world. As ambitious as it was, it often became though overcrowded with its mechanics, made survival in horror feel a little bit more like an irritation rather than a need to want to survive. The stiffness of the game itself hasn't aged well at all, but you can really give it credit for what it was trying to do. Trying to immerse the player 100% in the world, allowing them to think outside the box, think within the rules of this world, connect between the character and the player unlike anything seen before. Do you remember being impressed by the FPS games that gave you the ability to, say, vault over walls or even lean around cover? Seeing full-on first-person cover systems wasn't really experimented with until the likes of Killzone 2 in 2009 and possibly Fear 3. It's crazy how in time we have seen the genre innovate from each other's successes. When I think of having the ability to slide across the ground, the first examples that would come to mind were possibly Bulletstorm, maybe Crysis 2, Far Cry 3. Do you remember when parkour was a big deal in games like Brink? It's been an impressive thing of beauty to see how the developers have created interesting ways to make characters really feel a part of the worlds that they are able to move within and interact with. And this has truly evolved within the last decade or so, to the stage that it feels odd that I grew up in a time where looking down an iron sight would have been a luxury. But something stands out to me, especially in the last 5 years. We have seen huge growth in the way that we traverse these worlds from a first-person camera angle. Most famously used in the Just Cause franchise and reassessing the meaning of chaotic freedom in an open world genre, the Grapple has really shown its effectiveness in the FPS genre in the last 4 years. Titanfall, Apex Legends, Battlefield, Halo Infinite, Doom Eternal, they are just a few. And it's safe to say the Grapple has really embedded itself in the modern FPS and changed the way that the characters interact with their worlds. And these interactions go way further than traversal. It could be something as simple as pressing a button or playing games from that character's perspective, pissing up the wall as Duke Nukem, or maybe finding something and using the world as a weapon itself. There is so many integrations and so many impressive ways that the first person character who we play as truly feel a part of the world despite not seeing them. And unfortunately for me, I feel the FPS genre so rarely finds interesting and inventive ways to make that player also feel connected with the character and the world. Not just on a mechanical level or even a psychological level. I'm not saying that every game here that doesn't have these freeway interactions to have the player really contribute a part of something like they did in Alone in the Dark makes it instantly a bad game, because I think not at all. The FPS genre creates some of the greatest games and some of the most important games we've played. There's no judge of character or quality if they have or do not have these things. But so rarely for me in this genre does the gameplay really create different sense of emotions, but that's just because how limiting it feels because of its camera angle. But I'm also not saying it hasn't been done before. There are many games that combined all three: player, character and world. For what it's become and what it's been slated for over the last few years and generations, Far Cry has truly stuck to its identity when it comes to the mortality of our protagonists. Starting as a Rambo meets mutant first person shooter back when the Far Cry series was owned by Crytek of Crysis fame, but it was when Ubisoft started taking control that it started seeing some very interesting changes, but none came quite as shocking or even unforgiving as Far Cry 2. Far Cry 2 has actually popped up on this channel a few times, and that's because I love it, and so many do as well. A fan favourite of the franchise, Far Cry 2 created a world that asks you to be on top of your game and asks the player to immerse themselves as the characters. How they traverse and how they survive in this world is all down to them and how they pay attention. Making note of how dirty and how clean your guns are can truly be a difference between life and death, as the guns would be able to be jammed during mid-combat and creating interesting and intense firefights in the moment. On top of that, everything that the player has to deal with, this world too is also very dangerous and even dynamic. Something as simple as starting a small fire could spiral out of control and change the moment-to-moment gameplay in a second. But where Far Cry truly found its identity for me was in its animations. Far Cry has a plethora of animations at this point that show our characters enduring what the world has to offer and reminding us that we aren't the Rambo superhero we all dream of being and we all expect from this genre because of the likes of Call of Duty. Too often in the modern first-person shooter do we see red screens and audio cues and aggressive head shakes to show us that we're at a dangerous stage of our character's health and possibly about to die. But Far Cry went out of its way to show something a bit different. Characters snapping fingers, pulling shards of metal out of their arms, popping fingers through holes to get bullets, ripping bullets out of their arm with their teeth while they're driving, fanning away the flames from their flesh, dragged away by crocodiles, attacked by sharks, wolves and anything else nature wants to throw at you, and of course, most importantly, a lot of duct tape. Always have the duct tape. On a very base level, these wouldn't usually work, they're just randomly generated animations at a time, but that's actually not the case. They all play out of context of what damage was caused to you in the first place, creating that bridge there and then between the world, character and player. The world has an effect like an explosion, the character then has to take damage waiting for the player to react, reacting with a healing animation. The character would then interact with whatever may have damaged them at the time, and it's showing what caused the damage in the first place. Having these small moments just playing context of the world really do create something truly immersive and truly dangerous. These may seem small, but they're very, very important to the franchise of Far Cry. These act as a warning to the player. We aren't invincible, this world isn't safe, and your role in this world is fickle by nature. I feel like at this point I should probably explain what I mean by a barrier of safety. Often when you play a first person shooter, you're told you're playing this badass marine, let's say someone from Call of Duty, what a coincidence, and you're put into this game. You're told you can dodge, you can take cover, you can shoot all the enemies you like, and all you get is a little thump on the head every time you take damage. Sure, every now and then there will be a cutscene that shows your character interacting with the world in ways that you really can't do in game, but then there's also this weird disconnect where you truly never feel as the character in these worlds despite participating in the missions. I want to explore that in between of the player and the world. How, for example, say in Resident Evil, you play as Ethan Winters, but you as the player have to really embody Ethan Winters to survive. I want to have that in between and that barrier of safety torn down immediately. It's surprising how little this technique of immersion and storytelling device is really used. But that's what brings me to what I could think is my favourite example of this being used, the Dr. Traeger scene in the first Outlast game. There is something quite beautiful and spectacular about the way the team behind the Outlast series put together the first person horror of the first game. Miles is our main character, and as Miles we was able to lean around corners, sprint at high speed, and even look behind us while doing so. We was able to have a whole entire intangible environment for him to be placed in, and on top of that you would often see his hands even interact with walls and rub all the way up and down them. But the use of Miles' limbs is something way more important than just immersion and tension building device. It's also used in a subliminal manner for the player to get used to. As the player, we get used to this image of Miles' hands interacting with corners and touching the ground as he crawls, and it helped us become one with this character, and it helped us understand that we are him and we are in full control of his actions, and it's something that we didn't really get to see at the genre at the time. Understandably though, developers of first person games don't like to usually use this type of immersion because it will take a lot of players out, and that's the last thing any developer want, especially for the horror genre, because it could suck a player right out of the idea of being themselves in the situation, because it makes you go, oh yeah, I'm this person. But instead, allowing the player and Miles to become acquainted with each other and allowing them to embody themselves within Miles' animations creates an important connection between both the player and the character that really does help build the horror in later parts of the game. And then finally enter Dr. Traeger. And then the gruesome scene begins. This scene finds Miles being wheeled into a bathroom covered in blood and who knows what else, and you can only expect the worst. Of course, most first person games would possibly allow you to escape and run away, but instead they make you sit for a full first person torture, seeing Miles get his fingers ripped off and cut right at the bone. It's not nice and it's not pretty, and it's exactly what makes it so awesome. Seeing Miles' hands dripping with blood and the bones poking through the flesh is something unlike anything you've seen in the genre at the time, and it truly made you realise how uninvincible Miles is. You might not survive this, and that's perfect. Mechanically, this doesn't change the game at all. The game is still exactly the same, but there is one psychological change that we see and physical change that we see with Miles. Now that he's got a few fingers missing, every time you lean around cover or even crawl across the floor, you have a grim reminder of what this place has in store. It's just perfect, amazing. Outlast 1's great.
Then it gave me the power to make things right. The kind of stuff you only see in your worst nightmares.
Something quite noteworthy I want to speak about here is I use a lot of first person gore as an example to show how someone could possibly die or that someone isn't as invincible as the genre usually makes you feel. But there's a good example in The Darkness 2 where we see the complete opposite reaction to that. Jackie is having a meal out with his mafia dudes doing a whole good fella thing, which is amazing, and then all of a sudden, bang! Jackie is wounded on the floor, and you can see that half of his foot has been blown off due to this explosion. During this, he's trying to subdue the darkness and not give in to its power anymore, and trying to live his life as a normal human. Well played to him, until this happens. But for this reason exactly, this is what gives this scene a full impact and works so well within this game. Jackie finally unleashes the darkness and fully embraces it, and we see him grow his foot back and become the brutal mafia vigilante that we all know and love. And this game there and then in this cutscene perfectly bonds player, character and world like no other. As Jackie and the darkness become one, the world acts as a tool but also a weapon and also an obstacle for the player to interact with. But while doing this, Jackie has to focus on combat. While you're shooting guys, you can look around, find car doors or rip off and use as shields, and then grapple with enemies and grab them and do animations, which are some of the most beautiful and gruesome seen in the industry, allowing the player to have a full fantasy that lasts nearly the entire runtime. And this is just a beautiful example of what I'm talking about. Player, character, world, all in sync at all times, and there's definitely no better place than a masterclass of empowerment than the Darkness 2.
Embrace the darkness, Jackie.
So this brings me on to the recent Resident Evil games, but most notably Resident Evil 7 and 8. I briefly mentioned my enjoyment with the use of the gore in this game and how it altered the atmosphere of Resident Evil 7 before in the past, but I felt like it was just way too cool and I didn't say enough about it, so I just want to take a deeper dive. And then Resident Evil Village came out and it solidified everything I loved about the horror techniques used in Resident Evil 7 and only made Ethan's troubles so much worse. The Resident Evil franchise isn't new to the use of barrier breaking between the world and players. In fact, we see it used in the very first game. Starting off as a fixed third-person puzzle shooter, Resident Evil 1 really experimented with this new 3D technology. Oh, it's 1996 by the way. Anyway, getting used to the controls and how the players feel, and even getting used to the characters like Jill, Barry, Chris, Wesker, you begin to search for the rest of your team and your lost partner. All of a sudden though, you come across this small hallway and you see something off about this man at the end. Of course, you're ready yourself for the worst because it's a horror game, and then this happens. In this cutscene, there is no Jill, no Chris, no Barry, no sandwiches. It's just you and this monster. This game looks you dead in the eye. This game connects the world and the player in a moment, and it's one of the most iconic and terrifying monster reveals in the industry. And that brings us to the opening scene of Resident Evil 7. Ethan is thrown, stabbed, smashed through walls, all with player inclusion, having to press buttons and be aware of what's happening on screen. The player involvement here is small but very important to the illusion of danger. Being able to beat Mia with an axe or trying to stop her from stabbing you in the face over and over again is just a small moment of panic, and Capcom invites you to really take a part of the situation and try to fight off despite it not really making any difference. Creating that connection between you, the world and the character right there, right then. And then the game all of a sudden pins Ethan to the walls and tells you to press the R trigger to solve the issue right now. Can you pull the screwdriver out of Ethan's hand, causing the player to quickly react and panic in fear? And why is this a perfect scene to showcase all three? Well, Ethan reacts just like the player. When the player is told to press the trigger to pull out the screwdriver, Ethan's hand will so too go towards the screwdriver and try and twist it out as quick as he can. While trying to release his hand though, there is stuff also going on in the background. We also hear a chainsaw revving up, and then all of a sudden Mia appears walking towards the player slowly, making you panic and making you even believe for a second that you might have succeeded just before this happens. You are left in pure shock because in the beginning of your Resident Evil game, you're now looking at a bleeding stump of your hand. Just like Outlast, Capcom uses Ethan's full body to effect to really allow the player to connect with him and become this character with no face. Capcom quickly removes the hand of our protagonist in one of the most bizarre intros to a Resident Evil game that's ever been put out there, and this very quickly allowed Ethan to be split apart from the godlike characters we know from the franchise, and once again embody the fear of Resident Evil and what it should mean to the player. You're not invincible, and you're not guaranteed to survive. That's how survival horror works, and that's what I love about these new Resident Evil games. But there's no way they could top this. It literally was the most bizarre thing I've seen in the first moments of a video game. Resident Evil Village really had the tough job of having to rebuild that bond between the player, Ethan, and the dangers of its world. And also because the player had now become used to Ethan, his interactions and safety had to feel way more personal and even intimidating to the previous entry, and they had to show us more and gruesome ways and just bump everything up to 11. And oh god, did Village do that. Very much like 7, in the first moments they build the tension really high. They make sure to remind you that this is a horror game and then quickly rip a chunk out of Ethan's hand by a lichen. And you just see this lingering shot of his bleeding, ripped open hand wound, and it's made a vocal point for you in the first moments of this hell. And there and then reminds you that the game hasn't changed at all, and Ethan is just as bad as he was the first time around. Ethan's gaping wound is quickly bandaged, but also stays in the player's view for the remainder of the game to make sure you don't forget. But I mean, surely things can't get any worse for him, can they? I think Capcom enjoy putting Ethan through torture because it goes way beyond the quick gross out here in the game and is used as content and story building devices. There are even concepts in the storyboards of him being hurt and tortured in ways that we didn't see in the final game. But if there is one beautiful conduit of pain and violence, that is the incredible Lady Dimitrescu. The U isn't silent. The downright shocking amount of damage that Ethan endures while in Castle Dimitrescu is sickeningly genius. Being swept from his feet by hooks and dragged across the floor, blood drunk from his slit wrist, hung from ceilings by the hooks, and then having to rip his hands in two to get down from said ceilings, and then having bugs swarm him and crawl through his skin and out of his hand, and of course... And most of these all require a player involvement in some sort of way. Whether it's a small interactions to start that cutscene, like touching a door, or surviving an onslaught, or even maybe yanking your hand off the hooks yourself. Having the player involvement again like Resident Evil 7 really allows you, the player, to be on that same wavelength as Ethan as the character in the moment. There's no coincidence that all this happens in the very first real stage and so much pain is set up. Ethan really quickly needed to become weak in comparison to these lords, and Capcom showed this through him being tortured and battered just by the first person he came up against. And this quickly puts the player's confidence in Ethan all the way back down to rock bottom, and they had to do that in the most beautifully gruesome ways they thought imaginable. I'm sorry this video went a little everywhere, but I've been thinking about this subject for a while. I've always been so entertained by the idea of how first-person games decide to truly include the player into their worlds, whether that be them playing the part of the role of them to be a character in this world as themselves in horror. I love the fact that now that games are really starting to really involve the player with the character's actions and the environment, and to make you feel like you're not this immortal first-person beast. It's something I've been wanting to speak about for a while, and ever since I first played Resident Evil 7, it's an idea I've been lingering with, and I've made subtle reference to it in the past on my 5-finger personality video, so I kind of feel like this is what I've been wanting to talk about for a while, and I'm glad I got it off my chest. I don't know how coherent it is, but it's definitely something worth putting out there, and I'm really glad I was able to make it and come back to it and just have fun with it. Obviously, I know this isn't the only way that player, character and world can interact. There are many ways this has been done, even in the third-person genre, in the likes of Zelda, Death Stranding, and don't even get me started on VR. That's a totally different level of interaction. That's a different video for a different day. But if you enjoyed this video, please let me know. And I also want to know more games that do this. What other games do you know that actually change the characters' appearances and actually feel like you could possibly be damaged behind this wall of safety that the first-person genres often create for people? Please let me know in the link down below. I love you all. And of course, I will see you at the next checkpoints. Goodbye.